Thank you, Cody. Appreciate you having me. It's always a pleasure to work with you guys, and Hackathon is such a fun environment to be doing these presentations. So typically we talk about corporate venture. I talk about that quite often, and this time when we started thinking about topics that I want to share here, I was like, let's make it something much more relevant to our audience here. And how does life actually evolve after the hackathon? And what are the next steps? What are the things that startups do when they go beyond the hackathon? So I'll go through the presentation quickly. I'll also be available for questions if you have any at the end of the session, and I'm also happy to share the slides later if required. So before we get into that, I wanted to quickly give an introduction to who I am, where I come from. I'm lead the North American arm of corporate venture for Hilti. A lot of you might know what Hilti is. Some of you might not. Hilti is a construction tools and materials company. We founded in Liechtenstein about 80 years back. And our legacy was in power tools. We made power tools, we make drills, combi hammers, demolition hammers, saws, and so on and so forth. And over a period of time, we started doing other things like materials, like anchoring materials, fastening materials. We moved into measuring, and of late, we've also moved into software and asset tracking and so on. But two things that have stayed constant over a period of time is our commitment to innovation and a direct sales force. So we are fully integrated end-to-end, right from R&D to manufacturing to distribution, sales, service, all of that. And that has held us in good stead. And that has also helped us stay close to our customers. We're also a family-owned company. All the shares are owned by the Hilti Foundation. And we are a truly diverse team. We're present in 120 countries, and we have about 30,000 people who are working with us. What I specifically do is lead the corporate venture arm. And what this means is I look for new technologies and look for investments, acquisitions, partnerships. We're also thought partners to our business unit leaders in terms of shaping their product roadmaps. And we manage the external ecosystem. So we have a couple of fund investments, we have some portfolio investments that we look after, and other partnerships with the ecosystem players, right? And because we are also a lean team, we have a few areas that we tend to spend a little bit more time on in terms of focus areas. So within construction tech, topics like robotics, battery technology, IoT, reality capture are very important for us. And from a business side of it, things like job site collaboration, asset tracking, workforce tracking, safety, wearables, exoskeletons, data analytics, and AR/VR are also interesting topic for us. So this is something, these are areas that we focus on. And before I start jumping into the topic, I also want to give you context on why I feel so passionately about this. So apart from leading the venture arm, I also am actively involved in the startup landscape, whether it's Silicon Valley Robotics or Alchemist. I'm a mentor at a couple of accelerators. I'm an advisor to a few startups. And for us, this ecosystem is very early. So it's very, very important that all of us contribute to it growing rapidly. So now enough about me. Let's move into the interesting topics, right? So as a startup, there are different stages in your life, right? Right now, all of you are the hackathon, and all of you probably feel strongly about a certain idea. So you come up with the idea which you think could succeed and could find traction in the market. So this is the genesis stage of evolution. So at this stage, you're trying to figure out, is this thing something for you? But also you're trying to figure out if you want to do it alone or you want to find co-founders, right? So that is the stage at which you are today. But as you move forward, there are different steps that will come in your journey, and the expectations would be different in all of these steps. The first step would be just trying to get to product market fit, right? So that's the stage that I'll talk about the most today. Call it embracing the hustle or bootstrapping. So we'll get into the details of it in the next few slides, but that's the first step. And once you've done that for a while, then you start to realize, yeah, this is for the long term. This is something that you really want to supercharge. and therefore you probably are not able to do it without raising capital. So then you talk about, okay, who are the players I want to raise capital from? Who is this? VCs? Is it corporate VC, corporate venture capital? Is it angels, accelerators? So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then once you've started to do that, then you position your team for success. We'll talk about rapid growth. You start building your team, you start thinking about unit economics, you also start thinking about, okay, how do I sustain my differentiation? So I'll talk a little bit about that today because that's much further out. So we won't get in the details of it, but we'll talk a little bit of that. And finally, it's the exit, right? There's IPO, it's acquisition, whatever it tends to be. That is the goal, end of it, right? That's the mark of a successful startup. So you do want to get there. So if we get to the exit, that's amazing. So we won't talk about the exit because that's fairly straightforward. But we'll talk about the first few stages in a little bit more details today. So before we get into that, stage one, the genesis, all of you are passionate, you found an idea. But there are a few characteristics that are very important when you start thinking about a startup. And I think about this as a group. I think about these expectations from a founder team, not just any founder, hopefully from all of them, but as a team, all of this is important. The first thing is leadership, right? Leadership in a startup is critically important. I probably don't even need to talk about it because you are driving everything, right? You have to drive your team. You have to drive the people around you. You have to drive the thinking process, you have to drive the networking process. So leadership is critically important when you start startup, and this is a value all of you will have, right? Secondly is self-motivation. A startup journey is not a smooth road. There are ups and downs all over the place, right? And there's no external parties who are going to motivate you. So it's very important to have the self-motivation as you go through this journey, right? Third is integrity. VCs will only invest in someone they can trust, right? If there are instances of VCs catching startups lying, right, then you're dead to them. They will never invest in you ever again. Your reputation is destroyed, right? So integrity is the foundation of building a successful company. And that's one thing that you cannot compromise with you, with co-founders, with your team, with anybody else. That's something you have to completely keep in mind when you pick your team, right? Ability to create strong networks. So in every aspect of work that you do, whether you are reaching out to your customers, or you're reaching out for funding, or even you're trying to hire a team, your early growth will come from your networks. It won't come from advertising. It won't come from marketing. It will truly come from building strong relationships. So having founders or co-founders who are able to generate these networks is very, very important at the early stage, right? As a startup, something you already see is willingness to take risks. So you've already done that by starting to dedicate some of your time to come and be part of the hackathon. But when you talk about raising funding or going deep, typically people don't come along with you unless they see a level of commitment. So you have to take the risk and maybe jump full time to basically make sure that you show the spirit of risk appetite to make this successful, right? Competitive spirit comes without saying, right? You want to win. This is something your second place is probably not good enough, right? You have to win to ensure you get the funding. You have to win to ensure you get the customers and the talent. So you have to steel yourself for the competition around you and ensure that drives you. And competition shouldn't dampen your spirits. It should actually drive you to be better, which is also a link to perseverance, right? So it's not that success will come to you the first time. You have to keep trying and trying and trying. And this is especially important in the early stage when sometimes you don't see the light at the end of the tunnel, but you have to keep trying and eventually it does work out, right? And finally, the drive to innovate. So if you see, I haven't mentioned any technical topics here, right? Your expertise in certain technical domains is helpful, but that is not foundational for a lot of startups, right? All of these 8 characteristics are foundational. And then you layer in technical competence in that. And an aspect of that is the drive to innovate, drive to keep improving your product constantly. And that's how you ensure that you're ahead of the competition. So people say ideas are cheap, execution is what matters, right? So ideas are cheap if they're not acted on. But if you have a constant flow of ideas which are being executed on, then ideas are super valuable. So you have to ensure that those ideas keep coming through for you to present and show to the world as part of your startup, right? So, and as you step out of the hackathon, one of the first things that you'll want to do is try to figure out how to make it work, right? So how does this really happen? How do entrepreneurs really get it done, right? Most of it starts through bootstrapping. So bootstrapping is the art of creating something out of nothing, right? So why is this important? This is important because anybody who comes to invest in your startup looks for sweat equity, looks for what exists before they start to put the capital. The capital should not be the value of the company. The value of the company either comes from having the product and probably even having the product market fit, probably having some customers. All of this needs time and effort, right? And initially, because the idea is so nascent, you have no capital. So you have to ensure that whatever small capital that you have, you stretch it to the extent possible to make as good a product with as limited resources as possible, right? That is what bootstrapping is. And when we talk about bootstrapping, there are like 4 steps to this, which are quite important to think about. The first step, which you're doing right now, is validating your idea. It's creating an idea, validating it, and validation also can happen in multiple ways, right? Here, validation is not testing it with 5 million customers. Validation is just probably getting some validation through people in the streets, through your friends' networks, through some experts, to probably some VCs that you know. So this is very, very early stage validation. This is basically getting some proof that there are some customers out there who value what you're making. This is not something that's not useful to anyone. So that is the validation. So it's also trying to do validation without spending any money, right? With spending your time, because at this time you have time, but you don't have money. So how do you basically make that happen? So embracing the hustle is the second step of it. It's actually more than a step, it's more a process, right? It's more a principle that you embrace, right? You're doing 20 things at once. So there's probably just you and another co-founder. So you are the company. So there's no roles. You pretty much are doing everything. And sometimes there's not even enough structure. It's about getting things done than how you're trying to get there. So that part is very, very important. Focus on the cash flow. Keep the lights on. So at this, 100% of startups die because they run out of cash, right? So you have to make sure that the cash flow is there. And sometimes you supplement your cash flow by doing consulting work just to keep the startup alive. Sometimes you sell product. Sometimes you raise extra financing. How you do it? It could be in a varied number of methodologies, but important thing is you generate enough cash to make sure the startup survives till you reach the product market fit, till you reach the next fundraise, right? And finally, be resourceful and gutsy, right? Leverage your resources in the sense that you have your network. Maybe someone gives you a free apartment to work out of, so you don't have to pay for office space. Maybe you have someone else's hardware that you can use to test solutions. You basically have a 3D printer that you can borrow from somewhere. Maybe there are incubators which are giving you free space and free advice. Maybe there's an advisor network who can guide you in terms of how to form your company, can make introductions to you. So leverage everything you have, whether it's networks, whether it's resources, whether it's friends and family. Do everything that you can to stretch your resources and get to as developed a product as possible, right? I'll give you an example of one of the entrepreneurs that we know well, and he's done a good job of it, right? Albert at Smart Barrel. So he's a young Lebanese entrepreneur who was also an immigrant, and he has a background in industrial engineering and marketing. He started in the Middle East. He was a project manager there. He moved around. He went to West Africa and Caribbean. And then during one of the times in these projects, he realized that time card management was a big issue. And again, he's from the field, from construction. He didn't have too big of a network, but he realized he had an idea. So he wanted to make it work. So he spent time learning the local language. In Miami, he was learning Spanish because that's a language that was quite prevalent in the construction industry there. And he identified how time is basically in some ways stolen on the job site, right? So that's something construction companies were trying to optimize over a period of time. And after identifying the problem, he started working with a couple of his contacts. Over a period of 2 years, he basically built a product which could overcome this, piloted it locally, and did it incrementally, because he also didn't have VC fund infusion initially. So he built a product, he tested it with people that he knew very well, and over a period of 2 years, now he has $500,000 in multiple paying revenues. And based on that, he's also joined the Dreamit incubator. And now he's trying to build a network further to ramp up significantly. So it's a very interesting story of someone who's come from outside, who's actually integrated, put in the effort, bootstrapped, and finally is starting to ramp up on the journey. And it's not just small startups which have done this. So some of the largest companies that you see, Apple, Google, Microsoft, Oracle, Facebook, all of these initially were bootstrapped. They didn't have a ton of money to start with, but they had an idea, they had talented founders, and they basically made sure that they bootstrapped long enough for the product to be a success and get significant funding. And today, these are some of the largest companies in the world, right? So there is no limit on how far a bootstrap company can go. It's just that you have to keep going. And now we come to fundraising, right? So you've had an idea, you formed a founder team, you bootstrapped, you started to get some traction, you know your idea is good, and you have a customer base who could be willing to pay for it. But for you to hire more people, develop the product further, for you to start going to market and truly ramp this up, you need to raise money. And that money could be raised from various set of people. So depending on what stage you are, there are 5-6 areas, 5-6 sources of funding that you can reach out to, right? You can reach out to angels. Angels typically are wealthy individuals who are usually sometimes friends and family, or someone you know in your network, or someone who is a thought leader in the industry who's very interested in the idea that you're doing, and they write smallish checks. So for most startups, their first checks come from angels. So because they also help a lot of startups survive, that's why they have the name angels as well, right? So early stage, small size checks, sometimes industry expertise, but also higher risk appetite. So the angels are willing to fund entrepreneurs without a fully baked product. It's more on the team, more on the idea. So the risk appetite in that sense is a little higher than others. And also angels don't typically ask for typical ownership shares and so on and so forth. So that's a good place to start. You could also start with accelerators or incubators. So accelerators are good in the sense that they provide the structure, they provide an environment where you not just build your network, but also learn the basics about company building. Depending on which accelerator you go to, it is also good for your brand, and also it's good for exposure, right? So it power charges your acceleration through the course of the journey, right? You could also go to VCs. Again, when we talk about VCs are also varied. They're pre-seed VCs, seed VCs, Series A, Series B, and growth, basically early stage growth stage VCs. So you need to understand who you're talking to, and it's very important to match your startup to the right kind of VC, both in terms of stage, but also in terms of sector and thesis. So doing your research on what kind of financial VCs you're reaching out to is very important. Why are VCs helpful? VCs have a vast network. So from a connections perspective, they're quite helpful. VCs also take both seats and provide guidance. They've seen a ton of startups do this before. So that is quite helpful when it comes to VCs. You could also go to corporate venture capital firms. Corporates are much more strategic. They're typically not moving as fast as financial VCs. But with corporates, if you find the right corporate, they could provide you more technological support. They could provide you market reach support. Usually corporates tend to come in a little bit later than financial VCs, purely because of the risk appetite and stuff. But if you do find a corporate that is backing you early stage and you're able to deal with the pace of operation, then they could also be good partners. Finally, when you're a little bit further in your journey, debt funding is also something you could look at. It's not for the extremely early stage. It's probably something beyond Series A, Series B, but you can look at it if you don't want to dilute your equity, right? So this is mostly driven by banks who sometimes give you higher interest rate loans. This is typically also more for when it comes for hardware startups. Sometimes when you want to manage your working capital, so it takes some debt funding. So you don't want to take debt funding until you're generating revenues that can pay it off. So for very early stage startups without revenues, debt is a little bit more dangerous. You'd rather want equity, but later on when your equity is very valuable, debt is something you could consider. All of this also have some things that are good about them and some things that are not so good. I mentioned what's good about angels and accelerators and financial VCs, but there are also some downsides. If you look at an angel, because the angels are not very high in the involvement with the startups, some are, but a lot of them are not, you won't get the technical expertise that sometimes you'll get from more structured processes like accelerator, financial VCs, or corporate VCs. But on the flip side, they do come in very early and take more risk. So the angels are usually good to have. You just don't want to have too many of them on your cap table. Accelerators or incubators typically are very helpful, but typically they fund you at pretty low valuation levels because of the set standards at which they take startups. So you have to give them a percentage of equity for a certain amount of dollars that you get from them. Typically, the valuations you would get from them would be the lowest amongst the 4 or 5 funding sources that we talk about. When it comes to financial VCs, they can be quite involved, and they will drive you in different ways. In a lot of ways, it's helpful, but sometimes their directions, especially as you evolve, might not be fully aligned with your directions, especially if they come into the end of their fund cycle and they need to exit, whereas you are still growing and you probably don't want to be acquired or you don't want to IPO and so on and so forth. So typically this only happens in a few instances, but there could be a difference in priorities when it comes to financial VCs. They'll also be quite involved, and the expectations are always that you grow faster and faster and faster. So financial VCs of all of these probably put the most pressure in terms of performance, in terms of funding sources. With corporates, while they can be super helpful and super strategic, they also tend to be slower of the lot in terms of execution, in terms of the internal processes. They're not as fast as some of the other players in the space. And they have some of the same issues as well in terms of aligning priorities, right? The corporate priorities are not always aligned with startup priorities. So that's the watch out. With debt funding, it's just that they don't provide strategic value, right? It's just debt. So of all the other sources, you'll probably expect some strategic value. With debt funding, you don't expect it as much. Also, the approach to pitching to all of these is also slightly different. Angels is through networks and relationships. Accelerators and incubators, there's a formal application process. VCs and corporate VCs is understanding the fit, firstly, but also understanding how exactly you can reach them. It's either through networking or through the websites, but networking and warm intros are probably the best way to go. Debt funding is, again, straightforward. You can just reach them through the existing channels of, say, Silicon Valley Bank, get to the right contact, and you'll have access there. Now we move to the last stage on company growth, right? You basically had the idea, you bootstrapped, you found the product market fit, you raised money, and now you're at a stage where you need to get supernormal growth, right? So what are the things that you would focus on in this stage? There are 5 things that I would say you need to focus on. First and foremost is building a team. This is the time when you raise funding, when you need to build a really, really solid team, right? So depending on whether you're in Series A or Series B, the initial focus would be building the team closest to you, right? The head of product or the head of marketing, head of sales, all of those guys or girls would be in your team early on. But once you go beyond that, your role also changes as a CEO or CEO. You are thinking more about strategic thinking. So you need to make sure your team is independent and they are able to lead their teams, right? So you start thinking about culture of the organization. How do you ensure that the direction of the company is still the same? Everybody thinks and is aligned, even though you're not having daily interaction with all of them. So culture building also becomes an important component of what you're doing as you develop. Second thing that you need to think about is your go-to-market approach. So first few years or first couple of years, you're starting to think about product. Okay, is this the right product? How can I differentiate it? Do my customers like it? What is the product market fit? But once you start getting there, then during the growth phase, you need to think about, okay, how do I deliver this to the customer? Am I a completely SaaS platform, which is product first, and is my product doing the selling? Or am I a more B2B product where it's not just the product, but it's also how I reach the customer, or what level of service support I provide them? So understanding what your go-to-market approach is very important, whether it's a direct sales model, or whether it's just an online model, or you have outbound motions in place. You just have to figure out which area you're going to be spending, how you're going to market, basically, right? Ensure product differentiation. This is another important one, right? So while your product might have found the product market fit, that is for that instant in time, right? So you have to ensure your product team is constantly innovating. It's constantly differentiating. So this is something that you cannot forget during the growth phase. You have to know, okay, where's the next S curve coming from? And how do you get to a stage where your product stays differentiated? So that's critical for a startup through your life, especially in the first few years, right? Solidifying unit economics. Early stage, you're just trying to crack the problem. You're just trying to get something that works, that the customer wants to buy. You're not thinking about profitability as much, right? Because you don't have the scale, you don't have the also probably the nuanced solution that the customer wants. But as you're trying to scale your startup, this becomes increasingly important. This will also define how you're funded in the next rounds. So ensuring that you're not burning $1.20 to generate $1 of revenue is super important. You probably just want to burn 10-20 cents to get $1, right? That is profit. But if this doesn't work, then it affects everything. It even affects your existence of a startup if you're not profitable at some point in time. And while you're doing all of this, securing future financing is super important, right? As I said earlier, 100% of the startups fail because they run out of money. So you might be doing everything good, but you might not have paid attention to financing, then you still be in trouble. So you have to harness all the good stuff that you're doing and be able to communicate that to investors and line them up over a period of time so that you don't run into a situation where you run out of cash. So cash management remains important through the life of the startup, right? So that was the last thing I had to say before I move into questions. So I will pause here and see if there's any other questions. And I'll let Cody, if you let me know if there's anything else. Otherwise, we can also put this on the web and make it available for people to view.
Sure. Yeah. At this point.